Brand new transcripts out in the last hour from one of the witnesses in the impeachment probe who painted with explicit detail the jarring and disturbing picture of a foreign policy process hijacked by the president's political allies. George Kent, a senior State Department official in charge of Ukraine policy, testified about being sidelined by acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney in favor of the three amigos. That would be Gordon Sondland, the ambassador to the EU, Energy Secretary Rick Perry, and Kurt Volker, a special envoy to Ukraine, who has since resigned. Kent will appear on the first day of public testimony next Wednesday, along with Ambassador Bill Taylor. Kent is expected to detail the irregular policy process that sought to pressure Ukraine to investigate Trump's political rivals. Today's transcripts confirming the president's explicit desire for a commitment from Ukraine to investigating his political opponents. From that testimony, Kent, Ambassador Gordon Sondland had talked to the president, and POTUS wanted nothing less than President Zelensky to go to the microphone and say, investigations, Biden and Clinton. Kent also details the level of alarm among career officials about the pressure campaign run by that irregular channel of officials and Rudy Giuliani. He describes an interaction with a colleague in which he warned of the danger in pressuring a foreign government to do Donald Trump's political bidding. Kent, on August 15th, the new special assistant to Special Representative Volker, Catherine Croft, came to my office and asked me, have we ever asked the Ukrainians to investigate anybody? And I told her, if you're asking me, have we ever gone to the Ukrainians and asked them to investigate or prosecute individuals for political reasons? The answer is, I hope we haven't, and we shouldn't, because that goes against everything that we are trying to promote in post-Soviet states for the last 28 years, which is the promotion of the rule of law. Today's release of Kent's testimony revealing more corroboration of some of the most alarming allegations in the whistleblower complaint and offering a preview of some of what we might hear from Kent in that televised hearing next week. As the next public chapter of the impeachment inquiry gets underway is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, Associated Press White House reporter Jonathan Lemire, former federal prosecutor for both the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, Barrett Berger, and political reporter for the New York Times, Nick Confessori. Let's first go, though, to Capitol Hill, where Garrett Haake is standing by. Garrett, these transcripts, I wish they came out more in the 12 to 2 range, not the 2 to 4 range. I'm going to need a new prescription at the end of this. But what's amazing, what is sort of piercing in this testimony, and I think what distinguishes it even from the others, is Mr. Kent almost sounds like the conscience of the State Department. I mean, he articulates in his testimony the historical role that the United States under Democratic and Republican presidents has played in bolstering, not just militarily, these former Soviet states, but in helping them stand up a rule of law. It's startling to me to read his reaction and his sort of realization that it was our country's president assaulting the rule of law.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's clear why Democrats are putting him together with Bill Taylor in that first open hearing on Wednesday. These two are obviously ideological allies. You've got a pair of old Cold Warriors here, now invested in building up these post-Soviet states and trying to expand their institutions, teach them about the rule of law, and shape their anti-corruption efforts that way. And as you read through Kent's testimony, you see a couple things develop. First, you see his alarm at Rudy Giuliani running around behind the scenes in Ukraine and giving interviews and sort of trashing the now former ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. That's the first thing that gets Kent's antenna up. And then over the course of the summer, he sees Taylor and other old Ukraine hands get elbowed out of the way by that combo of Perry, Sondland, and Kurt Volker, who are taking over Ukraine policy on behalf of the president. And he describes this almost Volker getting pulled to the dark side here, where Volker decides he's going to try to work with Giuliani to shape this in a way that Kent and Taylor clearly are uncomfortable with. And then ultimately at the end, getting disillusioned with the State Department and their failures to push back on this. And in fact, their efforts to keep him from coming to testify. And what he says is misinterpreting his role in coming to testify in the first place. It's a fascinating testimony and deposition, and it dovetails so clearly with Taylor's experience on the ground. You can see the story that Democrats are trying to tell, I think, by putting these two men together at a table on Wednesday.
Well, I want to dig into the substance with you and everybody here, but I want to key in on something you just said. They're ideological soulmates. The ideology they seem to share is American patriotism. And they seem to play. I mean, it seems like Democrats are trying to checkmate Republicans and say, you're against these two? These two don't have a right-left policy perspective. I've read every word of both of those transcripts. Quickly, I will confess. But there is no right-left sort of scent or odor in anything they say. Their ideology is what John McCain used to believe, what Lindsey Graham 7 versions ago used to believe, what Democrats and Republicans have believed since the end of the Cold War, that the United States of America stands for the countries trying to stand up against Russia. I mean, what the Democrats appear to be trying to do is to put the least ideological, the least political, the most American voices up to look at the Republicans and say, what's your problem with these two?
I think that's right. And Taylor describes it probably more explicitly than Kent does. This idea that Ukraine policy has always been bipartisan. The idea of standing up these post-Soviet republics to be the firewall between the West and Russia is not something there was any daylight between administrations, Democrat and Republican. And here you see a U.S. policy that's been consistent for 20 odd years, and then a Trump administration policy, or perhaps not even the whole administration policy, but this small, irregular subgroup of people working closely with the president who are pursuing this other policy altogether. And Kent's the one who puts it into perspective, saying this is not what we have been trying to do here for all this time. And he and Taylor are trying to find out what's going on here and what role is Sondland and the president and all the rest of these folks playing. I think it's something that we'll get more deep into as we get into the open hearings. But yeah, these are the first two to sound the alarm, one from Ukraine, one from Washington, both very concerned about what they're seeing.
And Jonathan Lemire, another sort of plot line that keeps re-upping itself is Pompeo's either impotence or what would appear to be the only other explanation, he's been coerced by Trump and Rudy as part of the conspiracy to extort the Ukrainians for dirt on the Bidens. So what is the sort of sense from inside Pompeo world for which path he's on?
Right. At the very least, Pompeo did nothing to get
right. The impotence defense.
Yeah, right. No objection whatsoever. And I do think that you make a really good point, and Garrett did too, about these two testimonies being paired next week. Because it's voice of it's not Republican, it's not Democrat. It's what America is supposed to be about in terms of its foreign policy. I keep going back to Taylor's opening testimony, which was released a few weeks ago, where he spoke about how this would undo all the progress that has been made in Ukraine, which should be a bulwark against Russian aggression. They've been there for us. We need to be there for them. They should be an ally. Who can depend on us. And he described, remember so vividly, that he looked over that bridge. Yeah. He was in the Ukraine, and he looked over and saw those Russian-backed militia forces over there, and sort of put a real human face on this and said, this is the toll here. It's not just about politics. Lives could be lost if this military aid is not delivered. And I think what the Democrats are doing here and putting these two men up first is sort of really outlining the stakes. And in terms of Pompeo, he does. He looks, if nothing else, he looks impotent here, that he is willing, he's kowtowed to Trump, that he has refused to stand up to the president. He's yet another guardrail that has fallen away and allowing the president, and in this case, Rudy Giuliani and this other cast of characters, to run roughshod over American foreign policy and, frankly, American interests.
Barrett, I keep thinking about, where this is heading. And when you get to the specific charges that the Democrats will be trying to prove, it'll be abuse of power. These are obviously effective and unimpeachable witnesses on that question. But I wonder what the specific sort of crime would be or article would be around the details about what they did to Ambassador Yovanovitch. I mean, some of the most searing testimony is around Pompeo's refusal to defend or protect her from a smear campaign. I know you've got some great reporting today about the origins of the smear. Some of the smears in this ugly, ugly chapter of Trump's presidency. But let me read some of this from the transcript that just came out. Kent says the request from the embassy endorsed by the European Bureau that there should be a high-level endorsement of Ambassador Yovanovitch. The questioner asks, and then what happened there? Kent responds, there was no high-level department endorsement of Ambassador Yovanovitch. The questioner, what did the State Department do? You described a series of complete falsehoods in your words. Kent responds, yes. Questioner, fabrications, a fake list that's going to the heart of the ability of the ambassador to serve correctly. Kent responds, correct. Questioner, and so is it fair to say that this was a big league crisis for the ambassador? Kent responds, this particularly after there were tweets by members of the presidential family. It was clearly a crisis for Ambassador Yovanovitch and a crisis that was threatening to consume the relationship. So our recommendation to our superiors was that there should be a clear statement of support for Ambassador Yovanovitch. Obviously, the rest is history. None came. There still hasn't been one. And in her transcript, we learned that on Monday, I think, that she still feels threatened.
And I understand why she does. I mean, this was just harassment at its most basic. I mean, it's difficult to try to put it into a purely legal context because exactly as you said, the question is it an abuse of power, right? And at least from what we know so far, it seems like there's a very definitive answer of, yes, this was an abuse of power. I mean, if you had to sort of find the equivalent legal statute or crime that may apply to it, I mean, in some ways, it almost sounds like extortion, right? Like you need to take certain positions. You need to do certain actions of, praising Donald Trump publicly, maybe tweet something out or you're going to lose your job. That's not how we convince career public servants to do their jobs the right way is if you don't praise the leader, you're going to get fired. I mean, we typically demand that based on their actions, not, their tweets.
And I mean, Jonathan, you've been there. I mean, he spent a lot of time. He's been to North Korea. He's got a real affection for Putin. I mean, what you're describing is precisely the kind of conduct and relationships he covets from those autocrats.
No question. I mean, the president has felt more comfortable with authoritarian leaders, like Vladimir Putin and at times Kim Jong-un, who he's met with now, I believe, 3 separate times. And this tweet here, it was a tweet from Donald Trump Jr. That was the moment here that this referred to in the transcript, where he suggested that the ambassador was bad news, was a bad actor, and was a deep state plant to try to undermine what President Trump is trying to do. And again, it's just yet another example of how irregular this all is. That this is not how American foreign policy is supposed to be conducted. It's not supposed to be conducted by tweets of not just the president, but the president's son. It's not supposed to be conducted by the personal lawyer of the president, who was the former mayor of New York City, who has no foreign policy credentials whatsoever. It's supposed to be done through the State Department and through the White House and through the National Security Council. And that is not what we're seeing here. What they're doing, as to quote John Bolton, it's a drug deal. That is what he assessed it to be, and that's how it comes across here. And no wonder it has rattled so deeply all these career officials.
So let me go to a place we don't go very often because it's confusing. But what also becomes clear here, and irregular is sort of the best thing and the worst thing about diplomats is that they use words like irregular. I've read enough of these now. Irregular means corrupt. This was the corrupt channel where Rudy Giuliani was smearing and shaking down the Ukrainians for dirt on the Bidens. I mean, that's it. That's the whole story. But what Kent details is that the whole cover story that they wanted a statement on corruption is, I'm already in trouble for swearing. My son has a dollar jar for me, was baloney. They were putting their finger on the scale for the old ousted corrupt figures in the Ukrainian government. They were getting rid of the people in the American diplomatic corps, and they were pressuring the new leaders of Ukraine who were against corruption. They wanted the corruption, and they wanted to corrupt the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship to smear the Bidens.
What happened in the Ukraine from U.S. officials is how gangster states work. And imagine the surprise of President of the Ukraine that he's trying to clean up his country and transform it from a gangster state into a free country. And here comes the president's son and his private lawyer, who, by the way, is out there working on some deals for himself, and asking him, essentially extorting him, to get the U.S. aid. And in exchange, he has to basically invent a story. And that is the key takeaway.
So important.
From the testimony, from Kent's testimony, he says he wanted 3 words in there: investigation, Biden, and Clinton. It was almost like a Mad Lib. It didn't matter what they were going to say. What they wanted, and the sole thing they wanted, was an announcement, a public announcement that there was something being investigated. It didn't even seem to matter to them if it proceeded from there. What they wanted was a cudgel they could take back home to the U.S. and wave on the campaign trail. That is not how American foreign policy is supposed to operate. It's not how it has operated in the past, for the most part.
You know, Garrett, there's so much rich detail in here about Mr. Kent's discomfort with these irregular policy channels. And you can almost hear the Republicans say, well, Donald Trump can have whomever he wants involved in foreign policy. And that'll be their defense. But you can't say that the United States government has the right or the power to extort a foreign leader. I mean, I'm curious, what sort of arbitrary lines are they drawing around the specific conduct they're going to excuse away and defend?
I think this is the way that Republicans will try to defend this. First, they're going to try to discredit Gordon Sondland. Both Taylor and Kent rely a lot on Sondland. Neither one of them spoke directly to the president about a lot of these things. And Republicans will say, this is all coming secondhand from Sondland, who, oh, by the way, has come in and changed his testimony once already. He can't be trusted. See, Democrats aren't even calling him to come speak. So they'll try to blur the line on that. And buried in this transcript, you've got Republicans asking Kent a lot of questions about Burisma, which he says is a company that was, not especially well regarded. They will try to blur the line here and make the case that the president or his allies in this case was pursuing some kind of anti-corruption effort here. But you get into the weeds on what that means. This is not institution building as a way to fight corruption. This is not building up the courts or encouraging Ukrainians to follow a standard set of practices. This is very, very narrowly targeted effort by the president's allies here, and I think that's where you'll see the split. But Republicans are going to try to hammer very closely on that line. And over the last week, Republicans I've talked to on the Hill have tried to focus everything back on the call, make this about the call, the call, the call. And I think that's part of the reason you're seeing Ambassador Yovanovitch get called next Friday to come testify. She's separate from the phone call. She's separate from the core allegations against the president here. But by bringing her in, you expand the timeline here. You say this was this long, corrupt effort here that started in the spring. This wasn't a one-off phone call. There's this whole thing here. She's the prequel to the main story, but she will be, I think, a very important point as Democrats try to keep a broad lens on this and Republicans try to just focus on the narrowest possible definition of what the president did or didn't do.
And it would seem that in either scenario, Garrett, the president has a lot of exposure. Today, they had a witness who was sitting on the call on behalf of the vice president. And my understanding of the vice president's current state of non-answers is that he didn't know that Trump had conditioned aid on a favor on that call, which I find hard to believe, having traveled internationally with the president. Those are long flights. There's plenty of time to read your brief and do your homework. And do we know anything about today's deposition from Pence's national security advisor, who gave a deposition, or maybe she's still there today?
She has left. We know she was on that phone call. I think the third witness now who's come in. Folks are just starting to break up from this meeting. It was not especially well attended as far as these depositions go. So we're still chasing down a lot of the details. But the point is interesting here because Pence has been just a degree removed from all of this all along. And one of the things we know from the changes to Gordon Sondland's testimony was that it was on the edges of this meeting between Pence and Zelensky that Sondland pulled this Ukrainian official aside and said, look, this is the actual deal here. So at least other people in Pence's traveling party knew the real score here. It's strange credulity to some degree to think that Pence didn't when someone in his own staff was on that call. And as you point out, it was on, there's that very long flight to Ukraine, or to Poland in this case, and then it's on the sidelines of that meeting that the message is delivered to Ukrainians.
It's also, Jonathan Lemire, where the lie was told. I mean, the lie Sondland told that he came back to try to protect himself or prevent a false statement to Congress charge was around his conduct in the wake of the Pence meeting. So if any sort of winking and nodding took place, we know they're not good at that. The Stone trial's underway. Manafort's in jail. Flynn was found. I mean, they don't often pull that off. But the lie that Sondland told pertained to a meeting where he sought aid in exchange for the investigation in the wake of a Pence meeting. It would seem that there is sort of a link in the story that centers around what Pence knew and when he knew it.
Right. I mean, the Pence team has denied that he knew anything about this, but it does, as you just pointed out, it defies credibility that would be the case, that he would have no inkling whatsoever, even if he wasn't completely read in, even if he wasn't part of the original scheme, that he would have no idea what was going on. Again, he denies it, but that's what other people are trying to figure out.
Can we just take through the timeline? I mean, we know that after the call, there was so much concern. And a call came in from the general counsel to the CIA to the White House counsel's office.
Right.
So I mean, the West Wing is tiny, and the vice president's office is in it. So you've got the general counsel from the CIA shows up. She's in the counsel's office. The counsel's office then locks down the transcript. It's for a call that his aide sat on. So there's now buzz. I've worked in the West Wing. If all that happens, there's a little bit of buzzing. There's a little bit of electricity in the air around this call. So she was on this buzzy call that's now been locked down in a secure server, and she said nothing on a 12-hour flight to Warsaw. I mean, give me whatever drugs they're taking. I mean, that's
Dr. Ronny Jackson. Not on the flight anymore. But
I mean, that does not add up.
No, it would not seem to be. There's no reason. As you point out, the West Wing is very small. This is also a vice president who tries to stay very close to what's going on with Donald Trump. He doesn't disagree with him, certainly never publicly, but he wants to be part of that.
He's always in the Oval Office.
He's always in the Oval Office. He wants to be part of the conversation, in part because there have been such persistent rumors that someday he might be off the ticket. So the best thing the best thing he can do is try to stay close and to prove his value and loyalty to the president, and that often means proximity. The two of them share a ton of time together, not just the weekly lunch, but the vice president there have been a number of times when we've been called into the Oval Office for events, and we were surprised to see the vice president there. He is part of the sort of permanent entourage. He kind of comes and goes, as part of that Grand Central Station feel that Donald Trump's Oval Office has. It defies logic or believability that he would not have at least some sense of what was going on.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.